Age of Wonders 4 was just revealed. The brand new strategy 4X game with turn-based tactical combat, published by Paradox Interactive and developed by Triumph Studios. In a live stream today, they started by showing this trailer, but there was much more than that. Not only do we have some new high-res gameplay screenshots, and all of the information that you could ever need if you're scratching your head and wondering, what's Age of Wonders 4? Or what does it deliver differently from other games in the franchise? This is the video for you. And with the trailer out of the way and an excitingly fresh release date that isn't an announcement of an announcement of an announcement, we'll spend most of this video looking at the new gameplay that was revealed for Age of Wonders 4 coming May 2nd, 2023. Now, the live stream looked a little bit like this, with the developers kindly talking in the bottom left, gameplay in the right, and some border, but that's not quite my style. So for the rest of this video, I'll change it up slightly, and we'll focus, of course, just on what they revealed. I'll cut out a couple of slow bits, but for the most part, here it is. And with time cards below, the first section of the live stream was spent on one of the core gameplay underpinning fundamentals of Age of Wonders, and that is how you create an empire and the customization involved. As you can see, they start by setting it up at a base level, setting up a game to start with. You can think about this like a skirmish map, a campaign, however you want to think about it. The key thing that they talked about here was that there's some playability and customization around the world and the landscape, and that'll have a real impact on the societies and the people playing within it. What's more juicy though is when you get into the faction customization here, where you create a new race and a new ruler. And we'll talk a little bit more about how these play through in the Pantheon feature that we're looking at the moment later in the video. But for now, I want to address the actual customization of the people themselves. Your people, of course. Here you can see they're selecting a race, because in Age of Wonders 4 we can create our race from scratch, using, of course, some of the forms and features that they've put in the game. The first step, as you can see, looking at these ghostly, slightly nude-looking dwarves, is to select a form, whether it's elves, humans, moles, orcs, you name it, there's plenty to choose from. It's of course just the start of the customization, but I thought it was a neat little feature, and to be honest with you, viewer, I'm a sucker for a character customizer, so show me a ghost orc any day and I am away. They are, of course, also selecting physical traits and mind traits as well. So it's not just a cosmetic form, but actually there are some really real gameplay implications. And you can kind of see how that plays out more as we move through into the culture screen. Here I want to highlight two things. Firstly, once we've selected our form, now it's time to select our culture. Will we be feudal knights, raging barbarians, or perhaps someone more interested in magic and the arcane? Of course, each of these cultures have, again, impacts on our gameplay. Will we perhaps favor food and development, peacefulness, or combat? Or again, maybe we're just interested in summoning familiars and shooting magical spells. The other thing to note is that these on the right are color-coded, just like society traits. You can see the very first one here, Chosen Uniters, in the yellow, then moving through into the red and the blue and so on. The idea here is that as you assign these society traits, you're furthermore developing your people. But not just your people, but also the kind of game that you want to play, right? Because this is still a 4X game. Chosen Uniters, for example, will give you extra income from your vassals. Your shielded units will have extra rank and some additional alignment. Now, we don't need to go into the detail about what all of those things might mean, but it's important to know that this is, of course, more of a diplomatic, perhaps a peaceful play. Then as we move through to look at some of the other types, devious watchers, for example, gifted casters, you can get a feel for the different types of societies that are involved. In the case of the live stream, if you're curious, they're building an orc race of cannibals that will now move through to be ruthless raiders as well, giving the nearest city owned a bit of extra food and draft per tier of units killed after successful combat. Obviously, the way that you develop your society will have a real impact on how you play. And given that Age of Wonders is boasting a world that is reactive and replayable, a theme that I'll return to a couple of times because they talked about it a lot on stream, one of the last things to do is to select their tome, this kind of magical tier 1 tome in this case. But as they mentioned, as you move through multiple playthroughs and start to get a bit of experience behind you, you'll be able to get more powerful ones. They're kind of selecting a magical aura behind their race. 54 of them to choose from. I believe there's plenty to go with. They choose in specializing in dealing with frost damage and inflicting frozen. And the only reason why I choose to highlight on their specific choice here is because that matters as we move through the video. They've built their race, they've selected their traits, and now we're going to see how it plays out in the actual world. Because of course this is just the gameplay setting up phase. The final thing to do is to choose your sort of ruler origin story, because as well as creating a race, don't forget you're also building a ruler. And this matters not just for your playthrough, but for future ones, because you might actually see the ruler and race that you've created come against you in a future setting. We'll talk about that in a bit. Finally, they go to select the Wizard King Gaudier type, giving their cities extra mana income and other effects, instead of choosing the Champion Ruler origin story, which would have given them, I believe, better standing with free neutral tribes, a bit of extra income on their cities as well. Because of course, we're not just dealing with a city builder, but also an RPG and a few other things thrown in the mix. Finally, the character customizer ends with, of course, the greatest level of customization, what you physically look like, from your body, your head to your toes, and also I see up the top left there some, by the looks, customization of your banner as well, which is neat, because of course in Age of Wonders there is a map building, but also an exploring, and then a tactical combat setting as well, where your character will appear in the fresh and real. Let's take a look now and transition through to the gameplay itself then. Here you can see their starting city, and also of course their character in the world, and sort of a stack of units alongside of them. And what they're going to do now is set out into the real gameplay. Let's talk about it. Here you can see they're navigating the map with their units, their army of course, and there are essentially two sort of main types of fight that can occur. Fight with monsters across the world, and then more significant to Age of Wonders 4, sieges. More on them a little later in the video, but here you can also note that there's of course auto combat as well as manual combat, and the option to retreat. They choose to just completely win and obliterate and pick up the appropriate yields as well, because of course we're dealing with a 4X game here too. This is our starting town, but there's much more to explore. They decide to break away a unit to get out and have a look around the world a bit. Of course, as a turn-based game, they are limited a little bit in what they can do per round, and each round there are certain things that they'll need to accomplish. One thing that I wanted to note is, as they move these units up to the north, they encounter this mad lad. Firstly, a free city, a barbarian tribe, and secondly, Durkog's Skull Splitter, who, as luck would have it, if you remember from the start of the video, we are cannibalizing orcs and ruthless raiders. Well, as it turns out, these guys are cannibal orcs too. How about it? And so, of course, as a free city empire inside of the world, we have an option to either take them down or build up our influence through packs of cooperation and different levels of influence, as you can see, moving right the way up to a pact of loyalty, merging them into our empire, and that is, spoiler alert, what they'll move to do. They also show off some of the more interesting things about the world. Here's the Fortress of Woe, an ancient wonder, for example, that provides its own benefits and unique yields if we can capture it. Because of course, being a 4X game, it's really a lot about not just the physical world and who we are, but also the things that are underpinning the gameplay. And here is an example of one of them. This is effectively, as they talked about on stream, Age of Wonders 4 Tech Tree. And also feeding into that replayability, there's an element of randomness here. You can see they have 3 abilities to choose from: a massive blizzard that'll take 7 turns, a warrior mark for a bit of extra strength and fighting, or the ability to summon a lesser snow spirit. Now all of these could come in handy, or they could choose to shuffle the research library and find some different tomes to grab. You'll note that the different tomes have different levels here too. They're going to select a tier 2 summoner tome and move ahead with that research. On the 4X town and city building side, we get a brief look here inside of the town and the different things that they could choose to build, from storehouses, vendors and workshops to more interesting things like shrines, or maybe, of course, some units. Here, our first look as well at the kind of differences between them. Of course, there are only 3 basic units, effectively, a couple of combat ones and a scout, as you would expect from any great 4X turn-based game at the start, but neat to have a look nonetheless. We'll of course take a closer look at combat in just a couple of minutes. Finally, they are also eyeing up some strategic spells. Remember at the start when we were leaning into our frost damage? Well, there's your frost blades. All of this, of course, is kind of vital context to the world that they are building in this one playthrough with this one race. Now, after introducing the gameplay basics, they start to move through a little faster, and I'll do the same here, cutting out sort of idle points now that we're familiar and comfortable with Age of Wonders 4. And if you are, by the way, you should consider subscribing. I like this game and other games like this, and you might enjoy my channel. Anyway, moving along, they find their target, and this will be the big juicy target for the video. It's a fire giant. And after taking a quick look at our own leader interface and having a look at the different ways we can equip things to leaders, it was time to move through. Not just another turn, but move through the next kind of phase of the live stream, where they're enacting with the real world. Because of course, as they claim, Age of Wonders 4 delivers a vast and reactive world. And part of that is that each realm, not only customized from the start, as we saw from Frozen Wastelands and Ice Queens, also provides a new event-based system. What I'm hoping will be another layer of replayability woven into Age of Wonders 4. The event-based system adds different levels of storytelling. We saw a little bit about it earlier, and as we equip that Frostblade enchantment on all of our units, further leaning into that Frostblade damage thing, I'm reminded that the Fortress of Woe, that ancient wonder that we looked at earlier, is now leaning in and providing some of that story and some events. In this case, they were tasked with choosing between attacking the captors or buying them off and stepping away, and they decided to take the coward's way out, spend the money, and back off. Of course, they had more important things to deal with, right? Like the fire giant, so maybe fair enough, but as you can see, it was eyeing up to be potentially a risky battle. Perhaps they made the right choice, but either way, I thought this was a good introduction into the new event-based system. Is this new across strategy games? No, I'm sure you've seen many event-based systems like this before, but they do certainly add an element of replayability, providing that they don't, come up too often or get in the way of more major gameplay interfaces. Here, just quickly, a second example. As they move through, there's actually a second layer to it, and the traits and sort of the societal features that we talked about earlier, maybe you're ruthless, maybe you're more of a diplomat, are playing out in the event outcomes, you can see. The middle option would be to release the citizens and return them, but we have some more aggressive ones, leaning into perhaps our ruthless raiding or cannibal stance even. The top one would be to capture the civilians for ourselves. The bottom one, my soldiers will escort you home. A slightly more diplomatic stance. I thought this was a cool way to bleed through the traits and individual elements of rulers that we talked about earlier and demonstrate the new event system in the game's world. And so, after spending a couple more turns in the game's world, it was time for them to enter this risky battle, where they have 424 combat strength to the enemy's 410, largely, maybe, thanks to that ginormous fire giant. We shall see. Anyway, Age of Wonders 4 is a turn-based tactical RPG, and of course, that plays out in the combat as well. Not quite down to the level of something like Total War, but with more control and player options than another strategy tactical 4X game, perhaps more than the average. Here you can see that each unit is of course holding its own tile, and then down the bottom of the screen, which I'll zoom in on here, you can see not only does it have a tier and various health attributes and others, but also of course it has those abilities in a very MOBA style 1, 2, 3, 4, however you want to describe the layout. Each turn is, as you would expect, limited by movements and strikes and blah blah blah. I probably don't need to tell you the fundamental underpinnings of how a turn-based strategy combat system works, But we should focus on what Age of Wonders 4 brings to the table. The developers spent a little bit of time throughout this fight talking about how they were leaning into certain features and combos, right? You can see that some of the supportive units are providing defensive effects, and then, of course, we have our ruler, our leader in the back, lining up for potentially some really powerful strikes or some strong defense, because of course they're up against a giant monster. You can see that the turns, the rounds, are fairly quick, despite the units having potentially upwards of 5 or 6 different effects. And you can see some of the combinations that they were working on earlier start to be laced through. Here, Ice Coffin, they're targeting an enemy unit to deal sustained frost damage, and hopefully maybe getting a freeze off as well to try and slow down the opponent. And I think that that is a good highlight of how combat will ultimately play out in Age of Wonders 4, at least in this version of it, because of course there are 2 different ones. There are these kinds of skirmishes where you send in your units, get them to fight, defend, try and save face, take down the enemy, ultimately fighting monsters that are roaming the world. Maybe they're hiding in wonders, or maybe they're just walking around like the ones at the very start. The second type of combat that will be introduced are sieges. We know less about these. They are newer, of course, to Age of Wonders 4, but they're promised to be more grand, with dozens of units fighting on each side, instead of this more kind of, sort of 3 or 4 units fighting on a fairly basic but interesting looking world. Skipping ahead just slightly through some of the slower bits here, I think you get a feel for the nuances of combat. Each unit brings their own strength, depending on how you've built your empire, and that will ultimately determine whether you take an aggressive, defensive stance. How you bring in magic, summoning, and all sorts of other abilities has a very real impact. There are a couple of other things that I wanted to note that were either discussed or just shown on screen throughout the fighting. There were lots of conversations, of course, around critical hits, combos, defenses, but also some of the nuances of the combat system itself. Not just from burning and freezing and other elemental effects, but also around the world. As you would expect, things like flanking play a key role in combat, positioning of your units, very important, but other things too, like this morale system, where allies killed, or having simply too many allies die, impacts the different morale chances of a unit, which could waver and flee from the battlefield. Of course, is a morale system new to strategy games? No. Is it another layer of depth and replayability to Age of Wonders 4? I suspect so. The battle concludes, as you would expect, with a comfortable, if not slightly staged victory, spoiler alert. I wanted to move on to discussing just a few more things related to either combat or the broader game here, though, at the end of the video. Earlier on, though, I mentioned something called the Pantheon. We also took a quick look at it, and we'll take another look once we smash this fire giant. It might not mean much to you, but the Pantheon system could very well be the biggest improvement in replayability and general enjoyment of gameplay in Age of Wonders 4, more so than anything else we've discussed in this video, because it will add to a living, almost kind of Lord of the Rings, Mordor RPG style replayability. Fundamentally, as you build a realm, create a race, move through everything that we've done, maybe you explore, capture a wonder, get a little bit of storytelling, you're building an empire. But that empire and that story doesn't have to end when your game ends, when you lose or hopefully win. I don't know why I didn't start with win. In the stream they mentioned that you can ascend your rulers to the in-game Pantheon, and that will give us ways to either further customize them or our future experience. The way that they note most importantly is that in future, say once you've smashed this fire giant with your super spell and you're moving through into the last stage of the game, you'll be able to encounter creations as rivals or allies in future playthroughs. So that nasty race of, say, cannibalizing, ruthless raiding orcs with no regard for people's safety that you love to march around the world and take everybody down with, Yeah, well, maybe once that's done, you might not be so lucky when you encounter them next time. It is, by the way, an option that they mentioned that you could turn on and off. So if you do want to go through and just burn the world every time and not have your world burnt, that is something that you can still do, thankfully. But moreover, I think that it was kind of the icing on the cake. Cool, I've got this replayability. Cool, you've let me customize my look and feel and everything else to do with my race. And now I might also bump into them in the future. Of course, we'll have to wait and see further detail on not only how that will be implemented into the game, how significant it'll be, but moreover, what Age of Wonders 4 will deliver when it releases, as I mentioned at the start of the video, on May 2nd, 2023. I'm looking forward to covering it more in some more detail, maybe a little bit more analysis, most certainly some gameplay, as it's only a matter of months, maybe even weeks away, depending on when you're watching this video. I think that we're probably going to see information come fairly thick and fast now about Age of Wonders 4, the new turn-based, tactical, 4X strategy game with some surprisingly interesting RPG elements that's captured my interest, and hopefully it's captured yours too. Thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you next time.